The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning in October, sandwiched between a water bill and a catalog I had never subscribed to. It was cream-colored, heavier than standard mail, with gold lettering on the front and a return address I recognized immediately as my mother-in-law's house on Birchwood Lane. I stood at the mailbox for a moment before opening it. Something about the weight of it felt wrong, formal in a way that did not match anything I was expecting from that address. We were 9 months into divorce proceedings. Communication between our families had reduced to what passed through attorneys. There was no reason Sandra should be sending me anything by post. I opened it in the kitchen with my coffee going cold beside me. It was a wedding invitation. My husband Daniel's name was printed on the front in the kind of font people choose when they want something to feel timeless. Beside his name was a woman's name I had heard once, briefly, in a conversation with my attorney that I had tried not to think about too much since. The date was set for the following April. The venue was a vineyard about 40 minutes outside the city. Dress code, dietary preferences, RSVP by the end of November. I read it 3 times. Then I turned to the last page, which listed the contact details for the event coordinator and a partial guest list of people to whom the formal invitations had already been sent. Halfway down the second column was the name Margaret Osei Bonsu, spelled with 1 letter transposed in the surname, sent to the correct office address on Fielding Street. Margaret Osei Bonsu was my divorce attorney. My name is Claire. I am 34 years old. I was married for 7 years, and I spent 9 months of my life trying to end that marriage with as much dignity as I could hold on to. I want to tell you what happened when I realized the people I had been negotiating with in good faith had never been negotiating at all. Daniel and I met when we were both 25. He was calm and organized and easy to be around in the way that certain people are easy to be around when you are young and have not yet learned to look past the surface of ease. We married 3 years after meeting, bought a house in the suburbs, and had 2 children, a daughter who is now 6 and a son who is 4. For most of our marriage, I believed we were building something real. I understood later that what I had mistaken for partnership was proximity. We were in the same rooms, but we were not in the same life. The conversation where he told me he wanted to separate happened on a Sunday evening in January, after the children were in bed. He said he had not been happy for a long time. He said he did not think we wanted the same things anymore. He was measured and calm in the way he always was, and I sat across from him and felt the floor of something give way beneath me. Not because I had not sensed something was wrong, but because I had spent 18 months telling myself I was imagining it. I agreed to handle the separation as adults. We told the children together, using the language the family therapist had recommended. We established a temporary custody schedule that kept both of us equally present. I did not move out. Neither did he, initially. We lived in the same house in a state of careful, exhausted politeness while the attorneys worked through the paperwork. Daniel's mother, Sandra, had never made her feelings about me particularly subtle. She was not cruel in obvious ways. She was the kind of woman who expressed disapproval through omission, through the slight pause before a compliment, through the way she directed conversations about her son's future toward a version of it that did not obviously include me. I had spent 7 years finding ways to be comfortable in her presence. By the time the separation began, I had stopped trying. What I did not know, and what the invitation revealed, was that Sandra had begun planning this second wedding 8 months before it arrived in my mailbox. The invitation included an insert, the kind wedding planners use to outline the event timeline for vendors and key guests. It listed the initial planning consultation date as the previous February. In February, Daniel was still living in our house. In February, we were still attending joint sessions with the family therapist. In February, he had told me, in the parking lot of that therapist's office, that he was committed to making the transition as healthy as possible for our children, and that he hoped we could find a way to remain respectful toward each other. In February, his mother had booked a vineyard. I called Margaret that afternoon. She had received her invitation 2 days earlier and had been waiting to hear from me, uncertain how to raise it. She told me she had read through the entire document carefully. She said there were several elements of it that were directly relevant to our proceedings, and that she would like to meet as soon as possible. We met the following morning. She had printed the invitation and laid it flat on the conference table between us. She walked me through it methodically, the way she approached everything, without drama, just point by point. The first issue was the planning timeline. Our divorce had not been finalized. In our jurisdiction, remarriage before finalization of a divorce is not legally possible, but the active planning of a formal second wedding ceremony, complete with legal name changes implied in the printed materials, suggested a degree of confidence about the outcome of proceedings that raised questions about whether Daniel had been negotiating in good faith. Specifically, there were asset division discussions still ongoing, where Daniel's team had argued certain shared investments should be considered future income rather than current assets. The existence of a fully planned life already in motion complicated that argument considerably. The second issue was more personal, but equally significant. Daniel's team had made representations during custody discussions about his living situation and future plans. The idea that he had been planning a formal household restructuring for the better part of a year without disclosing this was relevant to how those representations would be evaluated. Margaret said she would be filing a motion to compel additional financial disclosure based on the new information. She said the planning timeline, documented in the invitation insert, would be entered as supporting material. She said this was not about punishment, it was about making sure the picture of Daniel's financial life that had been presented to the court was actually complete. I sat in that conference room and thought about February. I thought about the parking lot and the careful language and the word committed. I thought about how long a person can be in a room with someone who has already left. The months that followed were not dramatic in the way that legal proceedings look on screens. There were filings and responses and one additional mediation session where Daniel's attorney looked noticeably less comfortable than he had at previous meetings. Daniel himself said very little during that session. He had a quality I had always noticed, the ability to become very still and unreachable when a situation was not going his way. He sat with his hands flat on the table and let his attorney do the talking. The motion for additional financial disclosure was granted. What the subsequent documentation revealed was not anything illegal, it was simply more than had previously been offered. There were accounts that had been described as having minimal balances that turned out to be more substantial. There were assets that had been described as depreciating that had in fact been maintained carefully. The complete picture was different from the partial one, and the difference mattered when it came to what a fair settlement actually looked like. The custody arrangement was not dramatically altered, but it was clarified in ways that gave me more structural protection than the original temporary schedule had provided. Specific provisions were added about notification requirements for significant life changes affecting the children's living environment. The kind of provisions that would not have seemed necessary 9 months earlier when I was still operating under the assumption that we were both approaching things in good faith. The divorce was finalized in March, 1 month before the date printed on the invitation. I do not know whether the April wedding happened. I made a deliberate choice not to look for that information, and I have kept that choice. What happens in Daniel's life after the legal process ended is genuinely not something I need to know. I have thought about this carefully, and it is not suppression or avoidance. It is simply the recognition that my attention is more valuable pointed at my own life than at his. Sandra never acknowledged sending the invitation to my attorney. I do not know whether it was a mistake in the way that careless oversights are mistakes, or whether some part of her wanted me to see it. I have considered both possibilities and decided it does not matter. The result was the same either way. What I want to tell you, and the reason I think this story is worth telling, is something quieter than the legal outcome. During those 9 months, I had tried very hard to be the reasonable one. I had moderated my responses, protected my children from adult conflict, and extended good faith to people who were not extending it to me. There were days when that felt like weakness, when it felt like I was simply absorbing damage without defending myself. The invitation showed me that being the reasonable one is not the same as being the passive one. I had kept records, I had worked with a good attorney, I had protected my financial interests carefully, even while being cooperative on the surface. When the moment came where the truth needed documentation, I had everything in order. The reasonableness had not been weakness, it had been patience. My daughter started first grade this past September. She carried a backpack with a small bear keychain attached to the zipper that she picked out herself at the pharmacy near our house. I walked her to the classroom door, and she turned around once to wave at me before going in, the easy, confident wave of a child who knows the person watching her is not going anywhere. That is what the 9 months was for, that wave. I live in a house that is smaller than the one we shared, but quieter in a way that I have come to understand as the sound of a life that actually belongs to me. I still have coffee going cold beside me most mornings because I am always doing 3 things at once. Some things do not change. The cream envelope is somewhere in a folder in my filing cabinet. I kept it the way you keep things that turned out to matter, not to look at, just to know it is there. Some mistakes cannot be undone. The one his family made was simply the last in a long list of things they had not thought through carefully enough. I had spent 7 years being underestimated by that family. In the end, it was the thing that helped me most.